Mikhail Gorbachev has died at age 91. Gorbachev was admired and celebrated in the West for his role in ending the Cold War. He forged arms reduction deals with the United States and partnerships with Western powers to remove the Iron Curtain that had divided Europe since World War II, bringing about the reunification of Germany. But his internal reforms weakened the Soviet Union to the point where it fell apart, and many Russians have never forgiven him. His death has drawn mixed sentiments from various leaders. Gorbachev will be buried in Moscow's Novodevichy cemetery next to his wife Raisa, who died in 1999. Let's look at the legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev with senior research fellow and political economist at trade collective Lebohang Pheko. Lebohang, it's great to have you with us as always. Looking at how he's being remembered, was he somebody who was a failure as a leader, or a man who changed the world for the better?
Or possibly both. I think that in these things it's always difficult to have a yes or no answer. Things are neither black nor white, especially with such complicated historical legacies. I think the one is that he was possibly a product of his time. So the Soviet Union as an idea was one that was really reaching its conclusion by the time he entered office. So there'd been several, bereavements. That the Soviet Union had lost about 3 general secretaries by the time he came into office, over a very short period, like a 10-year period, so from Brezhnev and so forth. And I think what happened is, and President Chernenko, he was considered a younger blood of a different generation, a lawyer. And he was also caught up in the midst of very complex geopolitical, geostrategic conversations around Afghanistan, international relations, the Eastern Bloc, and what the idea of this bloc was going to look like. So the Soviet Union was already subsidizing this bloc to the tune of about 60% of its GDP, which is immense, which meant that on the ground, certainly on the day-to-day living for many Soviet people, was that there wasn't, there was a scarcity of basic essential items, there was a scarcity of medical care, and so forth. One would also argue that command economy and that very planned economy, which guaranteed people houses, guaranteed people work, so that the statist economy, where there were industries which were basically over-employing members of the population, was then dismantled because of the affordability, and also because Mr. Gorbachev felt that in the interests of glasnost, which was this, economic reform, it was becoming unsustainable, and he put in place all of these technocrats to then streamline the economy. But what happened was, of course, a lot of people were then put out of a job. So a potentially good visionary idea, which the West lauded, was certainly imploding internally. And then, of course, on the back of that was the Chernobyl disaster, which many people felt in the Soviet Union could have been better handled. And lastly, the perestroika that Mr. Gorbachev put in place, which was all about openness, freedom, and democracy, bit him somewhat, came back and bit him in the elbow, because, of course, then the new freedoms that many people in the Soviet Union were afforded meant that they then spoke out, not because he was the worst thing that had ever happened, but because for the first time they had the opportunity and the freedom and the right to be able to speak out in ways that they certainly wouldn't have been able to under previous leadership.
Very interesting, so people could express how they felt. So maybe lauded a bit more in the West than in his home country. Obviously, it's hugely mixed. But we have the president now, Vladimir Putin, sending condolences, although many would say what Vladimir Putin is determined to do is undo everything that Gorbachev did and get the Soviet Union back.
Vladimir Putin is undoubtedly a strong man in the realm and in the mold of people like Brezhnev and Khrushchev and these people that we read about in history. The strong men of the Soviet Union, and he was trained by that very same system. I mean, he was a very, very young man when late President Gorbachev came into power. He was already a KGB operative, very high ranking, and he has pretensions to be an imperial power and to restore Russia to the stature of the Soviet Union. And of course, what has happened in the intervening years is that the Soviet Union is minus several of what were effectively its colonies. And I think one of the, in the late 80s and 90s, since then, the world has changed significantly. So I think several countries decided to go it alone, Poland being one, Armenia, Georgia, the Ukraine. And in fact, the last time I was in the Ukraine many years ago, about 8 or 9 years ago, this popular sentiment was that they too, similar to South Africa, oddly enough, they also felt that they had been liberated from Russian imperialism. And many of them were expressing resentment that Russia was still the lingua franca in the Ukraine, for example, in countries like Armenia, like Mongolia. So I think that it's interesting that today President Putin is the one who's sending condolences, when in fact President Gorbachev at the end had spoken quite openly about how unhappy he was with the dismantling of his hard work in democratization, in opening up the markets, and so forth, and that this is really a return to a very austere form of Russian empire building.
Let's bring it home. Our former president, F.W. de Klerk, was sometimes called South Africa's Gorbachev. I don't think he liked that analysis. But were there any parallels between what South Africa was trying to do in dismantling apartheid and what Gorbachev was trying to do?
Yeah, I think the analogy between a Gorbachev and a de Klerk will always be tricky and problematic, and I think an interesting conversation for another day. But certainly in terms of systematically, many political scientists have used, including myself, have used the case study of the Soviet Union and the transformation and the transition, such as it is, of what we call the South African Republic today, post-1994, as contemporaneous and deeply analogous illustrations of what countries in very rapid transition have had to do and have had to transform themselves into, pivoting away from historically very statist authoritarian regimes in their different ways. And I think the interesting thing is that they have both fallen to some of the same foibles in terms of a very rapidly accumulative elitist class, capitalist class, and one which, of course, has been seen to be aloof and very adrift from the aspirations, the liberatory aspirations, of its people. And I think that certainly, when we look at, for example, the Soviet Union, and how, there's so many essays and many modules that are being taught of if Gorbachev hadn't failed, in inverted commas, if the Soviet Union still existed, what would it look like? And one would probably point to a more a country like China, perhaps a South Korea or a China, as one that has managed to rapidly evolve. China I don't think is a communist republic in anything except name now. It is a state-led capitalism, but a state-controlled capitalism, but using the very same machinery, the same utilities, the same kind of capitalist market orthodox rhetoric to grow itself, possibly on its own terms, but certainly not always redistributing in the same way. So many questions around the parallels between South Africa and the Soviet Union, but fair to say that as complicated as Mr. Gorbachev's legacy is within the former Soviet Union and Russia and globally, no one can dispute that he played an incredibly important and pivotal, albeit complex, role in making history.
Lebohang, we're running out of time, but very quickly, South Africa has been accused of pandering to Russia in our response to what's happening in Ukraine. We are seen as close. There's the BRICS grouping that seemed to be falling away, but now maybe strengthening as a different response, especially in terms of currencies and things like that. How are you thinking about South Africa's relationship with Russia right now?
South Africa, like many African countries, especially those of a particular liberatory formation and a liberatory constitution has had, an affinity to both China to a lesser extent through, liberation movements, and of course to the former Soviet Union and now Russia, as you rightly say. They have really, especially during the Ukraine-Russia dispute, they have milked their sense of historical leverage over African countries and South Africa quite considerably, reminding the African continent and South Africa of their struggle credentials and of their allyship towards us, and of course reminding us that unlike the West, they don't have a colonial footprint on the continent. I mean, all of these things are quite complicated because, of course, there's a whole generation of South Africans who were in exile who remember the deep racism that they experienced in Russia. I experienced it myself when I was in the Ukraine as well. So, I think that this kind of populist African opportunistic allyhood is something that I think is we should be quite wary of being pawns in what could be yet another other proxy ideological wars. But no doubt that historically the alliances have been strong. But I also am of the view that relationships need to be viewed not only through the prism of the past, but in the prism of today, and certainly on a more equal footing than a benefactor and struggling liberation movements versus independently sovereign states that we are also today.
And look at our interests. Thank you very much. Great to chat to you as always. Lebohang Pheko, Trade Collective Senior Research Fellow, there looking at the legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev.